Author and historian Mark Speck visits the Pigpen to give us a historic walk down memory lane of the World Football League of the mid-1970s. Join us in this tremendous gridiron history lesson in part one of our conversation with Mark, where we talk about the teams in the times leading up to the first game in that season of 1974. It's coming for you in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with PigskinDispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pigpen, your portal to positive football history. And we have a really special edition today, as we're going to go way back, probably almost 5 decades now. It's gone by very quickly. And we're going to talk about the World Football League that happened in the mid-decade of the 1970s. And we have a historian and author, one of the foremost experts on the WFL, Mark Speck, joining us today. Mark Speck, welcome back to the Pigpen.
Thank you, Darren. I appreciate you having me on. I look forward to talking to you and talk about the WFL.
Yeah, it's a very interesting subject, and I know you've written quite a bit about it, and we'll talk about your books here in a moment. But I guess just get a feel for it to kick us off here on the WFL, because this is sort of the first podcast episode that I've done that's dedicated to the World Football League. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what the World Football League was, maybe why it came to be, and anything you can share with us on it.
Well, Gary Davidson, who had kind of been part of the ABA, the American Basketball Association, and the World Hockey Association, decided he was going to take on the big fish in the pond. He was going to take on the NFL in 1973. Got the idea for the World Football League, even though through my research, it turns out this is the third World Football League. There was 2 other ones that were going to be called the World Football League that started up earlier in 1973. One guy in Oklahoma City, another guy in Omaha, and they had talked about getting it started, having some cities. They really hadn't gotten too far as much as the organizational level. They didn't get any farther than that, really. Didn't sign anybody. They had some cities named. They had some, not really much in the way of players or coaches or anything. They even gotten to that part yet. So Davidson's was actually the third, and then there was another one right after him called the United Football League, which Tony Rosano and another guy started up, Goldman, I think his name was, and they started it up. Actually, Davidson heard about those 2 guys, so he moved his announcement date up a couple of days just to beat them to the punch, because they were going to actually call theirs the World Football League. And then he beat them to the punch, said, hey, I've got this World Football League. We're going to start up in 74. And those guys were like, okay, well, we've got one too, but we'll call it the United Football League. But Davidson was the one that pretty much started it. Again, he was the president of WHA at the time, and the league was doing okay. It had just gone through its first season. There was some problems. There was some financial problems. But any startup league, you're going to have that kind of thing. So, but he thought, well, I'm going to try to take on the NFL. And that's what he tried to do. He got some guys together, mostly guys from WHA and the ABA that he knew. Dennis Murphy, Ben Hatskin from Winnipeg, Danny Rogers, Steve Arnold, and just got those guys and started up, and got them on the ground level. And they started up in the October of 73 is when they announced that they were going to have the league, going to start up, going to play, and starting in July. They had some cities together. They had Boston, they had New York, they had Philadelphia, Chicago. And so they got started. He said, we're going to start with this. About 2 or 3 months later, in January of 74, they had the big announcement where this is the league. We're starting up. We're going to start in July. We've got more cities now. We've got about 11 cities. And he had, again, most of those guys from his buddies from the WHA. He had Sam Battistone, who was the owner of the Sambo's restaurant that's not around anymore. But he was actually one of the owners of the New Orleans Jazz of the NBA. And him and Chris Hemmeter got the rights to the Hawaiians. They were pretty well off. Philadelphia had Jack Kelly, who was a local sports figure, local politician, well-known, classy guy. Nick Belletti, who owned the Cleveland Indians at the time and the Cleveland Crusaders of WHA. He got a team at first for Tampa, but he couldn't get any inroads in there as far as Tampa. And Tampa was on the list of NFL's expansion teams for 76. So he didn't really have a chance to really get in there. So what he did was he sold it to Tom Ariger, and Tom then moved it to Chicago. And he was actually the first guy to actually pay for franchise, was Ariger. Everybody else had just gotten in on the ground floor, and Davidson said, okay, here's your territory, here's your territory, here's mine, and all this. They never paid for them. And then when the next round of guys came in, they were the ones that paid for it. And the problem they had was, instead of putting all this money where they sold all these franchise rights to these guys, instead of putting it in a pool for the league to help bolster the league, they just put it in their own pocket. This first level of guys. So they didn't have any money, in a kitty or whatever you want to call it, or a bank account or somewhere to start, building up the league, hiring people, getting offices together, advertising, that kind of thing. They just didn't think of that. They just put it in their own pockets, and that was it. So it was now basically up to the individual teams and franchises to do that themselves. So they got that together in January. Chicago then, I think they were the first team to sign a player. It was Jim Seymour, who played tight end for he is from Notre Dame, and I think he played for the Bills and another team. He was the first active player to sign. And, they got started there. It's kind of late. I mean, I think you're talking middle January. They want to start in July. That's really kind of cutting it close, because you don't have a lot of time to really build it up. And, they got John Bassett, of course. Probably one of their best moves was getting him. He was going to go to Toronto, but the Canadian Parliament raised this thing. Marc Lalonde, who was the Minister of Health, I don't know how that tied into football, but it did. He raised a stink, said, hey, we don't want these guys coming into here. They're going to, ruin the CFL. They're going to steal all of our players. They're going to move into our cities. We don't want to have this. So they put got a memorandum together, and we're going to put it in front of Parliament and say, we don't want to have these guys. We're going to ban them. They did. It passed by a certain vote. So Bassett's starting to worry, because he really wants to be in Toronto. And he actually got the okay to rent the exhibition stadium. If you remember that, I think that's where the Toronto Blue Jays played their first couple of seasons. And he actually got the okay to rent that. And some of the people there were for him, but there was a lot of people that weren't, and they didn't want them coming in there. They thought it was going to be the downfall of the CFL. Canadian Football League was going to end because they were just going to move into all their cities. There was talk about some group of guys going into Vancouver. There was some talk about Calgary, even a little bit about Montreal. So they got on the stick and said, we don't want them up here. So Bassett finally just said, it's a losing effort. I'm not going to get in here. I don't want to, cause problems for anybody, including myself. So he had a list of cities that he was going to go into. He had one of them was Buffalo. There was Syracuse. There was Miami. There was Charlotte. There was Louisville. And he had quite a list. Milwaukee, I think, was on his list. So he had all these places where he wanted to go. Well, at the same time, Steve Arnold had tried to get a team together. He wanted to go to Japan, found out that was completely infeasible, monetarily and financially, to have travel to Japan. And they weren't really interested because they didn't watch it. They were more interested in rugby and soccer and baseball. They really had kind of had an introduction to football back in the 30s, but it really wasn't on their radar at the time. So it was not a good choice. So he said, well, I'm going to move into the States, see what I can find out. First, he wanted to go to Memphis. They didn't want him because, again, Memphis was another city that was under consideration by the NFL to be an expansion team for 76. So they didn't want anything to do with the WFL. We want to be in the NFL. They've hosted NFL exhibition games for several years to try to get them to come in, try to get them to add Memphis to their teams. And they wanted an expansion team. They wanted nothing to do with the WFL. They didn't want to say, well, in the NFL say, well, if you guys want to be in here, then we're not going to pick you. So they were like, well, we want to be in the NFL. So they were going through all that. They didn't want Arnold there. So he's looking for another town. He finally settled on Houston and got it in there. So now Memphis is open again. And then it turns out that the NFL didn't pick them. The NFL went into, pardon me, first it was Tampa and then it was Seattle. So now Memphis is stuck and they're kind of ticked off because they didn't get picked. Bassett hears about this, says, this might be a good idea. He goes down, talks to them. They're all for it now because the NFL's turned their back on him. So he says, I'm moving to Memphis. That's what he did. Changed his team name. It was the Toronto Northmen. He changed it to the Southmen. It wasn't very creative on his part. And I guess he just needed to, it was at this time, this was like in the spring, and he really needed to get something done. So he just kept the logo that he had with the grizzly bear, and it wound up the team actually had two nicknames, the Southmen and the Grizzlies, which in the crazy world of the WFL made complete sense. Most of the people liked Grizzlies because it was a grizzly bear logo. So they accepted him. They gave him a really good deal on Memorial Stadium, had a good lease agreement. He set up shop there, so he was set. But the other franchises were just having a lot of trouble. He had Joe Wheeler was trying to go into Washington, D.C., couldn't get a lease with RFK Stadium at the time, which was the Redskins. They had an ironclad lease. They finally bent a little bit and said, okay, well, you pay us $1.5 million and, you can come in. Well, Wheeler said he'd pay it like $350,000 a year, but they said, no, we want it all up front. Well, he didn't have it. So he said, so I think they probably knew that. He was kind of starting to run out of money. He tried Baltimore. That was pretty well booked up. Tried Annapolis, Maryland. Then he went to actually moved. He didn't actually move because it was still on paper. But the franchise then said, okay, we're going to locate in Norfolk, Virginia. So they moved to Norfolk. They were there for just a short while. Meanwhile, he's running out of money. He needs somebody to come in and buy the franchise or invest. He wanted to invest. He really wanted to stay in Norfolk, but he couldn't find anybody to invest in it. He was pretty close to having a good deal with Foreman Field down in Norfolk to play on. But, things just got to the point where he just needed money and he wasn't getting any investors interested. So then he run into Romy Loud, who was another guy that got stuck by the NFL. He wanted a team in Orlando. Turns out he had gotten passed over by the NFL for an expansion team. So now he was interested in a WFL team. First, he went to Houston to check about Steve Arnold because he was looking for investors and maybe possibly a sale. So he went there first, but then Wheeler's deal opened up here, and he said he'd love to have him down there. So he wound up paying for it, bought the team, moved him to Orlando. The team still trained up in Virginia for training camp. It was too late to move and try to get a new place. And also they had a tryout camp at Lorton Reformatory at the prison there, not far from where they trained. And they had like 440 people show up, and 12 of them were inmates. And actually the inmates actually got a good look, and they didn't sign any of them. They signed a couple guys that played minor league ball. But so now they're in Florida. The corporation name is the Florida Suns, and that's what Loud wanted to call them. We couldn't do that because he already had the Southern California Sun. So they said, that's going to be too confusing. We got the Sun, we got the Suns. So then he finally, a couple of days later, he was going to wait a little bit and try to come up with a good name. But the WFL said, look, this is May. We're starting in June. We're starting in July. we need you to get a name. We need you to get colors, all that kind of thing, because we got to send out advertising. We got to send out. And so then he come up with Blazers because it was, it symbolized fire, it symbolized the sun, that kind of thing. So he was set after all that rigmarole. Philadelphia kind of, after Jack Kelly come in, he was looking for somebody to help him out. There was talk of them moving to Mexico City. They couldn't get a lease in Philadelphia. Rizzo, the mayor, he was not cooperative at all. He didn't want them in the vet. He didn't want them in the Franklin Field, University of Pennsylvania. He actually threatened to take away their tax exempt status if they rented to the Bell. And so that was out. So they had a lot of trouble there. And like I said, they were going to move to Mexico City. There was talk of other like Portland, but they finally got a lease with better for worse with JFK, which sat about 100,000 people, but was really run down. But they got it. They got a lease to hold their games there. So they were pretty much set. Then Boston, they had a lot of trouble getting a place to play. They couldn't get Schaefer Stadium. They couldn't get Boston University Stadium. They couldn't get Nickerson Field, and they couldn't get Fenway Park. There was just no way to get a place to play. So then also, he was also having trouble. Howard Baldwin, who was from the WHA, one of Davidson's buddies, he wanted to try to get some guys interested. Nobody was interested in investing. He's running out of money. They said, look, why don't you join up with the guy in New York City, who was Robert Schmertz, who owned the Celtics and was pretty well off. So they said, well, let's just have you guys join together, pool your resources. Let's move Boston to New York. And then the New York franchise that Schmertz had, which was, again, on paper, was going to move somewhere else. So then they were set up shop in New York. Another example of finding a place to play. Shea was all booked up because you had the Yankees were playing there with the Mets because Yankee Stadium was closed because they were being renovated at the time. They looked at Roosevelt Stadium, which was just the only thing nice about it was the locker rooms because the Giants practiced there. So they had fixed up the locker rooms, but the stadium itself was just a mess. It was just decrepit. It was really beyond hope. They took a look at it and they just said there was no way they could play there. So they're running out of opportunities and running out of options to play in New York City. So they finally picked Downing Stadium on Randall's Island, which was about 24,000. It was an old, again, decrepit, out of the way. It was on Randall's Island. It was right near Rikers Island. There was a mental hospital like right next door to it. And I remember the players saying they could see the guys watching the games from their windows and from the mental hospital. So they got it, for better or worse, probably more worse than anything. The lights were from Ebbets Field, so they were terrible. They said, well, we're going to change all the light standards out. We're going to get more lights. The players joked they needed mining helmets to be on the field instead of football helmets. And then one guy said that on the kickoff, when you had the coin toss, you picked the dark side or the light side of the field because it was just really one part of the field that was well lit and the rest of it was really kind of dark. So for better or for worse, again, they're set up. The New York team, the New York franchise moved to Portland after going through about 3 or 4 owners. Again, having trouble raising money, not having any luck with getting investors. They had a guy named John Rooney from Houston who said, oh, I'm all set to go. And all of a sudden, all of his investors that said they had money didn't have money. So he wound up having to back out, but not before he had hired Ralph Goldston, who was an assistant coach at Colorado, who would have been the first African-American head coach in football if that would have gone through. But because Rooney lost the franchise, he never signed the franchise buying papers, the purchase papers or anything. He had basically just dropped out. So his contract with Goldston was null and void, but he sued them because of that, because he had a contract to be the head coach and now he didn't. So that, of course, one of the first lawsuits that the WFL had to put up with. And then after Rooney left, and they got Bruce Jelker in there, who owned the Saddleback Inns on the West Coast. And he was there for a while, pretty much in the role of a franchise holder, like the original guys. I'm here just kind of running the thing till I can find somebody to take it off my hands. That was a guy from Canada named Robert Harris. He had 11 guys with him that they were willing to go ahead and start in Portland. And he actually really wanted to join the CFL, but their expansion fee was like $1.5 million, and he could buy the Portland team for the WFL for like $500,000. So of course, I'm going to the WFL. He went there, and so they were kind of set. I never understood the whole fixation on Portland. They had so many franchises that we're going to go to Portland. Portland was a small city, really into soccer. And, in 75, to just kind of skip ahead, when the Thunder were in 75, they drew fans less than 10,000 a game. Meanwhile, the soccer team, the Timbers in the NASL, the North American Soccer League, they're drawing 25, 30,000 a game. And it's in the same, facility, Civic Stadium. So it was a big soccer town. I don't know why they had this fixation about they had to have a team in Portland, but they did it. And, the Hawaiians, they were set. Anaheim's, the Southern California Sun. They got Larry Hatfield in there, who was a trucking executive. Had a couple of guys with him. They got a good deal on the Big A, Anaheim Stadium, as they called it. And he got Tom Fears to be the coach. They were pretty well run. They had the money, and they signed up quite a bit of college talent. They got the 3 guys in the draft, Booker Brown from USC, and then James McAllister and Kermit Johnson, who are from UCLA. So they got some NFL players. So they were pretty well run. They were set. They had a good stadium. Chicago did well. They were doing well. Origer was a good owner. He was well financed, and he wasn't a crazy guy like some of the other teams, just spending money crazy. I was going after John Brockington, the Green Bay Packers running back, and he wanted like a god awful amount, and Roger said no thanks. So he was smart enough not to really just spend money all over the place, and so he was doing pretty well. He got Virgil Carter from the NFL, the quarterback. He got James Scott, who was a wide receiver, good rookie wide receiver. Then he had Mark Keller. And he had some NFL veterans like Steve Wright, who was an offensive tackle, Cyril Pinder, who was a good running back. So they were pretty well set. They got Soldier Field. They sold a lot of season tickets. So they were pretty well set. Birmingham started out really well. They had Bill Putnam, who was involved with the Atlanta Hawks, the Atlanta Flames of the NHL. So he had a good sports background. He was well-heeled, had good finances, but his problem was that, once he got started, he started signing all these guys, these future contracts. Now, the future contracts per se really weren't a problem. It was he doled out about $1.5 million in just signing bonuses. So, he had a good attendance there in Birmingham, because Birmingham's always had a good, football following, whether it's college or pro, and they were doing really well, but he had just spent all this money on all these guys from, Kenny Stabler, signed him. He owed him, come November, December, like $50,000 a month just for his. So this is money that could have been gone to the team to help run the team, pay his own players, pay his own office personnel, and he's doling it out to Stabler, or trying to, but that's what happened, was he didn't have the money to even pay Stabler. So quite a few of theirs really got breached, as they called it, because they're the missing payments. They had a ton of guys they signed, and I don't think any of them ever played for Birmingham. They had a good field. Legion Field had 72,000 people. Their first game, they drew over 50,000. So, they did well. The attendance kind of dropped off toward the end of the season when, college football with the University of Alabama, Auburn, and that kind of thing. High school ball was big there in Birmingham. So their attendance dropped off somewhat, but it wasn't that much that they really were hurting, except for the fact they had to pay all these guys, all these extra, this bonus money that they had to breach their contracts. Jacksonville, they weren't too bad. They had Fran Monaco, who was a guy down in Florida, down in DeLand. He had some laboratories that he owned. Really wasn't as well heeled as they thought. Called themselves the Sharks. They hired Bud Asher, who was a judge down in Jacksonville as the coach. He had some like the semi-pro experience at the time, but was really unknown. But they got a few NFL veterans in there, and he had Orlando. The best thing they did was get Jack Pardee. He was the coach and general manager. It was his first job as a head coach. He had just come from the Redskins. He thought he'd never be able to move up if he stayed there. So he went ahead and he signed on with the Blazers, signed a lot of veterans, just like George Allen, his coach there in Washington. He had the same philosophy. Let's get some veterans, guys that know what they're doing. He got a lot of guys that had been around. Mike McBath was a defensive tackle from the Bills. Billy Hobbs was a linebacker, bounced around for a while. His defensive backfield had a lot of guys like Miller Farr from the Oilers, but a lot of guys that were NFL veterans that were really good players. They tried to get Bill Berge. He was one of the guys they got in one of the future contracts, and they really wanted to get him. Obviously, he was very good. They missed a payment on his contract. He got upset about it. Then the Bengals got upset because he was kind of advertising and promoting the Blazers, even though he was still going to play for the Bengals in '74. So then Paul Brown got wind of it. They had a restraining order, put it on him. He couldn't practice with him. He couldn't say anything about the team. Wound up, they breached his contract. Then he got traded. Paul Brown traded him then to the Eagles, cut off his, basically cut off your nose tackle to spite your face. So he was out. Fred Hoagland never played for the Blazers. He was another one they signed to a future contract. So Detroit, that was a hot mess from the beginning. They couldn't get Tiger Stadium because they had the Lions had an ironclad lease there that ran, even though they were basically playing their last year in Detroit because they're going to move to Pontiac in '75 in the Silverdome. But their lease ran to '76. It ran a year after they left Detroit. So there was nobody else could play there in Tiger Stadium. Coleman Young, who was the mayor-elect at the time, convinced Davidson, we can get a lease. We'll do it. We'll be fine. They didn't. They couldn't do it. The Tigers kept telling them over and over again, no, we don't have, it's just not available. It's an ironclad lease. It runs to '76. So they finally picked Ypsilanti, Michigan, which was about 80 miles outside of Detroit at Eastern Michigan University. Very small stadium, a college stadium, small college. They had trouble signing players. They started out trying to sign players for like $10,000 each. And players I don't want to play for that, so they had to finally up the ante a little bit and find some players. They got Bubba Weiss, who was Sam Weiss's brother from the CFL. And a lot of their guys were from the CFL, some minor league guys. They didn't really have a lot of players that were really, well known. So they kind of struggled. The Lions did pretty well. They got a lot of rookies. I mean, obviously, football players want to play, are more attuned to playing football in Hawaii in the fall than playing in New York City or Boston or something like that, where it's still 75 degrees. It's beautiful. So I think they had in their first roster, in their opening roster, they had 5 veterans. The rest of them were all rookies, but they signed all these guys, and they were hoping to play in what became known as Aloha Stadium, where they had the Pro Bowl for many years. Well, they had all kind of trouble with that. They were going to be set for the beginning of the '74 season, but they had trouble with the construction. They had a couple of construction workers passed away, were killed, and while they had to call in like the holy man to come in and like bless the place. They thought it was cursed. So it was held up, didn't wind up being open until middle of the '75 season. So they had to play in the old, what they called the Termite Palace, which is an old wooden stadium in Honolulu Stadium, which sat about 25,000. So, and then they made a mistake of signing a TV contract locally to actually carry the games on local TV. And the people were thought, well, why do I go out to the game if it might be raining or whatever, when I can watch it at home? So their attendance really struggled because of the fact that these guys that started running the team, they called them the mainlanders because they were from the mainland. And these guys, they didn't know who else to put in there. And they put these couple of guys in there, and they were just signing these contracts that, didn't make any sense. They wanted to play on Sundays. Everybody else was going to play on Wednesday and Thursday. WFL said, we're going to concede the weekend to the college, to the pros. We're not going to try to go head to head against them. So we're going to go in and we're going to play our usual games on Wednesday. Then we'll have a Thursday night, like Monday night football would be Thursday night football. Well, Hawaiian said, no, we got to play Sunday. We're not going to change that. We want to play. It's not midweek football is not going to go over in Hawaii. So they wound up with the original schedule and starting to play games on Sunday. Well, you're talking about a team in Jacksonville playing on Thursday night, having to fly to Hawaii and play again Sunday. So, I mean, it was basically like playing like a Thanksgiving Day game on, say, like on Sunday and then playing on Thursday. So that really didn't work out. And it wasn't drawing any better on the weekends than it would have been in the middle of the week. So it was about August when they finally said, okay, we'll join the rest of you. We'll play on Wednesday and Thursday. They gave up the ghost on that, and they didn't do any better after that. I mean, they got a few better crowds because the team started playing better. Houston, a lot of veterans. They got Jim Garrett, who was an assistant coach with the Giants, to be their head coach. They tried to get Hank Stram. He didn't want to be involved, wasn't interested. So they got Jim Garrett. He signed a bunch of veterans, older guys. Jim Kanicki, who'd been around for years. Joe Robb, who'd been around for years. Mike Tolliver, who had played in the AFL back in the 60s. You had a lot of these old guys that were in there. And the one guy, Chad Brown, who played for him, he was a linebacker. He wound up being the first black referee in the NFL. And he wrote a book about, his experiences. And he talked about the WFL and playing for the Texans. And he said, our program looked like the guys in the program looked like they either stoned or way too old or both. And they probably did. I've seen some of the pictures, and yeah, they were older guys. They were like in their 30s. They tried to get Eldridge Dickey to play quarterback. They signed him, but he never showed up to training camp. They had Dickie Post, who had played in the AFL. He got hurt. Hoyle Granger, who had played for the Oilers back in the day, he retired. But he had a lot of older guys. Portland, they were late getting to the show through the ownership changes, and they were late signing players. They didn't really get a lot of big names. They did sign Dean Martin's son, Dino Martin Jr., to a contract, but he ran into some legal issues. They busted him, and he had all these like illegal firearms in his house. He had like a bazooka and an anti-tank gun, and they quickly cut him and released him. I think it was done mainly for publicity, just to have Dean Martin's son there. But yeah, he didn't last because of the fact that he had the trouble with that. I think that's just about all the teams that, starting out. You had they wound up being in 3 divisions. You had the East with New York, Jacksonville, Florida, and Philadelphia. And then the Central was Birmingham, Chicago, Detroit, and Memphis. And in the West, you had Portland, Southern California, the Lions, and Houston. So they were set there. They're getting closer to the season. And then, speaking of future contracts, you also had Memphis, which at the time they were still in Toronto, made the big splash there at the end of March by signing Larry Zonka, Jim Kick, and Paul Warfield. Bassett had asked their agent, Ed Keating, how much it was going to cost to sign them. Well, I guess Joe Robbie wasn't signing them, wasn't paying them very much. He was pretty cheap. So when he found out that it wasn't going to take much to sign him, Bassett went down, talked to him. They flew him up to Toronto. They talked turkey for a while. decided to sign the contract, signed him right there. He called, Zonka had called Shula to tell him. They called Joe Robbie to see if he had a counteroffer. He didn't want to negotiate over the phone. He wanted nothing to do with it. He thought they were just going up there to talk a contract, but they said, well, we're going to go ahead and sign. So that made a big deal. Again, I don't think the future contracts themselves really hurt. I know a lot of people on these groups and Facebook and that kind of thing, they talk about how the future contracts hurt them, but they really give them a lot of publicity and put the NFL on notice that these guys may have some more money than we thought, and they're willing to spend it and sign these big name players. So, after that, then you had Stabler signed with Birmingham, Craig Morton signed with Houston, so you had a Berge. You had a lot of guys that signed. I think that wound up, some of them said it was around between 75 to 100 players that signed these future contracts for 75, 76, 77. They had Rayfield Wright, Jethro Pugh, a couple of Dolphins, Bob Kuchenberg, and Tim Foley signed. So you had some big names. Curly Culp signed with the Sun. So you had a lot of these guys that were big names. Darryl LaMonica, of course, he signed with the Sun in his future contract. So now you got the NFL on notice. You got the fans got their attention by saying, hey, these guys got the money here to sign these players. We might want to pay attention.
I'm going to cut in right here because Mark has spent a lot of time with us, and we have a great talk. And we're going to continue this talk in a couple days on Wednesday, the 25th. We're going to have part 2 where Mark talks about that first season of the World Football League, and just such an interesting subject. And we're glad that he brought it up to this point so far of talking about sort of before they played any games. We also want to mention that Mark has multiple books out right now on St. Johann Press Publishers, and we have links to their website and to Mark's books on pigskindispatch.com and in the show notes of this episode. A couple of his books that he has, he co-wrote the World Football League Encyclopedia with another gentleman. The book Wiffle, W-I-F-F-L-E, he wrote by himself. That is a book on some of the more interesting facts, the wild and zany, sometimes hilariously true story of the World Football League. He wrote, like he mentioned during the podcast, that he wrote a book on the Detroit Wheels franchise called Nothing But a Brand New Set of Flat Tires, and another book, and a dollar short, which I believe is about the Florida Blazers. He's got another rendition of the World Football League Encyclopedia. I think it's going to be called Volume 2. It's going to be come out with some more added facts. That's in the works. And he's also writing another book on another franchise, the San Antonio Wings. It's in the process. It's going through some of the ending features there of getting the cover artwork and stuff done on that. So Mark has done quite a bit of research on the World Football League. Make sure you support him. Like I said, his links to his books are on pigskindispatch.com, and on St. Johann Press is his publisher. We have links to those all as well. So hope you'll join us back on Wednesday to hear the rest of our great conversation with Mark Speck on the World Football League. And we have more history coming to you tomorrow and days after that in between the World Football League. So make sure you check those out too. We thank you for joining us today and hope you enjoyed this little bit of history of one of those lost leagues in pro football history. Until tomorrow, everybody, have a great gridiron day. Peeking up at the clock, the time's running down. We're going to go into victory formation, take a knee, and let this baby run out. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back tomorrow for the next podcast. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. A special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? You should check out Row One Brand's Vintage Pictorum Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. Instead of a boring old tie, Get him a historic baseball photo taken by Henry High Sandom at the historic Polo Grounds Stadium in New York City during the 1894 Temple Cup. Or, if he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL poster. These are so good looking that you'll be amazed how they turn out. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order.